My name is Richard Solomon. I've been the professor at the University of Washington in Seattle, Washington, USA. Recently retired after teaching there for over 40 years, teaching Sanskrit, Indology, and Buddhist studies. I'm here in Seoul today in the occasion of the 19th Congress of the International Association of Buddhist Studies. And I came as a former president of the association. The title of my discussion today is Discovering the Forgotten Buddhisms of India. And I'll be talking about that particularly with reference to the Gandhari language and the Buddhist texts that have recently been discovered in Gandhari language. I want to go back to what's theoretically the beginning of this whole subject of the languages, the multiple languages of Buddhism. And the key phrase that you can start discussing this with is in the Pali Canon, in the Vinaya. And in Pali it says, it's a famous phrase, it is Sakaya Nritya, which means in one's own dialect. And this is a very controversial statement attributed to the Buddha, speaking to two of his monks. But it's much discussed in modern scholarship, and there are several different possible interpretations. I don't intend to go into the philological details of that. I'll simply use what is something like the conventional interpretation, which means the Buddha instructed his followers to teach the Dharma in one's own dialect. And whether it means the monk's own dialect or the audience's own dialect is controversial, among other things. But the general idea is clear, fairly clear, and it's fundamentally important for the history of Buddhism and the history of Buddhist scriptures and canons, because it, at least theoretically, sets the ground for the notion, for the principle that Buddhism is what I call a religion of translation. So I want to step aside for just a moment and talk a little bit about what in academic world is called comparative religion. And so it's interesting to compare what might be referred to as the four great world religions and their attitude towards the use of language and of scriptural language. So on the one hand, there are two religions in particular, I think of Islam and Judaism, where there is the religion and the doctrine of the scriptures are very strictly fixed with one language. So the Quran is always in Arabic, and every Muslim, in theory, should learn Arabic. The Old Testament, or Jewish Bible, as it's now called, was written in Hebrew, and that's the essence of the Old Testament is in the Hebrew language, and all Jews, again, in theory, study Hebrew and read the Bible in Hebrew. So those are traditions where the scripture and the language are firmly linked together, almost inseparable, we might say. And then on the other side, there's Buddhism and Christianity. And in both cases, translation of the scripture, the Bible or the Tripitaka, respectively, the translation into local languages is the rule, and it's not only permitted, but encouraged. So for instance, the Christian Bible has been translated into, I don't know, probably not hundreds, but thousands of languages. Buddhist scriptures have been translated into many languages. I'll mention some of the important ones in a moment. So there are interesting parallel there. Incidentally, it's always struck me as interesting that there's another striking parallel between the history of Buddhism and the history of Christianity, which is that both of those religions were born in their birthplace, that is to say, in what is now Israel in the case of Christianity, and what is now India in the case of Buddhism. And in both cases, they went out, those languages, and so to speak, conquered the world, if you don't mind that terminology. Christianity, to put things simply, conquered the Western world. Buddhism conquered the Eastern world. And both of them died out, or virtually died out, in their homelands, ceased to be the dominant religion of their original lands. I don't know why that is. I just mention it because it's an interesting, curious parallel. But let me go back to Buddhism, which is what I'm really here to talk about, and particularly about the Gandhari language and how Buddhism how that has come to be recognized, and just within very recent years, it has come to be recognized as one of the major languages of Buddhist scriptures. Excuse me. So this principle of translation in the Buddhist world, well, that's very familiar to everyone connected with Buddhism, that Buddhism originated in India and in Indian languages, but at a certain point in history, starting about 2,000 years ago, Buddhism spread into Central Asia, into China, into Korea, into Japan, and at each step, the scriptures or the favored scriptures or the important scriptures were translated into the local languages. So you have, of course, entire canons in Chinese and Tibetan, enormous bodies of literature, mostly translated from some Indian language, Sanskrit or others in some cases. And also I want to mention, it may be less well known, I'm pretty sure it's less well known, that Buddhist scriptures were also translated into many other languages, particularly in Central Asia. I think of particularly Tocharian and Old Uyghur. This is little known outside the world of specialists because those are languages of cultural regions which were Buddhist at the time. I mean, approximately the first millennium AD, but which ceased to be, for various historical reasons, they ceased to be Buddhist regions since many hundreds of years ago. So I just mentioned this to give an idea, to try to show how diverse and vast the translation enterprise in the history of Buddhism has been. So now I want to come back to India, where it all started, and talk about the language situation in Buddhist India specifically. So I think most people, a great majority of people, with the exception of a few technical scholars, if you ask, well, what was the original Buddhist language, what was the language of Buddhism in India, people will probably say Pali. And that's true, but also not true. And in the scholarly world, in the academic world of Buddhist studies, that is no longer considered a good answer. And a better answer was there were several or perhaps many languages of Buddhism in India. So why does Pali stand out? Well, several reasons. The main reason is Pali is the survivor. The texts Buddhist texts in Pali were transmitted to Sri Lanka and from Sri Lanka into Southeast Asia, and they remain the scriptural language or the primary language of Buddhism in those regions today. And of course I have to say it's an exception to the rule, because in those territories, in basically, I'll say just Southeast Asia, the translation urge was less strong, and in those countries, what they consider the original scriptural language, Pali, remains primary. But that's different from the history of Buddhism as a whole. But what I want to say, and what has been the outcome of many years of scholarly research and archaeological research, and I mean particularly the discovery of ancient Buddhist manuscripts in India and adjoining countries. So the result of that is to show to the satisfaction of most, if not all, academic historians of Buddhism, that Pali was far from the only Indian language in which the Buddhist scriptures were represented. Followers of the Theravada tradition who learn their scriptures in Pali would hold and are quite confident that Pali was actually the original language which the Buddha spoke, with the recorded precisely word for word for more than 2,000 years. Again, academic scholars doubt that. Most would say, and I would say, Pali was one of the Indian languages in which Buddhism was learned and transmitted. And so I'm now coming to my main point, which is as my title says, the forgotten Buddhisms of India. And I mean, when I say Buddhisms, I'm talking about different regional schools of Buddhism that use their regional languages. So what are those languages? Well, I want to go back. I said that this is all on an archaeological basis, or most of what I'm trying to present is on an archaeological basis. There have been several just major discoveries of Buddhist manuscripts in Indian languages within the last 125 years approximately. And I just want to mention the four most outstanding and influential discoveries. First, in Central Asia. And when I say Central Asia, I mean what's called the Tarim Basin. It's essentially Xinjiang in terms of modern Chinese geography. And that's not in India, but linguistically I treat it as part of India, because here's the main point. Beginning around 1900, thousands of fragments of Buddhist manuscripts were found, and the great majority of them were in Sanskrit. Not Pali, but Sanskrit. So that shows that there were Buddhist communities, numerous extensive Buddhist communities in that area whose scriptural language was Sanskrit. And most of the scriptures were more or less parallel to the scriptures we knew in Pali. So one could imagine at that time that one could begin to have doubts about what I've elsewhere called the myth of Pali primacy. That at least in northern India, that Buddhism used the Sanskrit as a primary language. And these Sanskrit scriptures were brought to Central Asia in antiquity, I mean in the first millennium AD, or CE, I should say. So that was about 1900. About 30 years later, in 1931, in a place called Gilgit, which is in far northern Pakistan, in the foothills of the high mountains, another huge discovery of Sanskrit scriptures of all kinds, both traditional, what we call Shravakayana, and Mahayana texts, dating from approximately the 6th, 7th, 8th century CE. So more evidence for Sanskrit Buddhism. Still more recently, about 25 years ago, a very large collection of Buddhist manuscripts was found in Afghanistan, in a place that's, well, not exactly identified. Unfortunately, we don't have the actual site, but why was it in these places, in the deserts of Central Asia, in the foothills of the high Himalayas, in eastern Afghanistan, and in northern Pakistan? We have now thousands of remnants of Buddhist manuscripts in that region, going back as early as, even possibly in the case of the Gandhari manuscripts, some of them go back even to the BC period, 1st century BCE. So there's a geographical pattern, and the geographical pattern is that they're all in the far north, in deserts or in dry climates of the fringes of what I use the term India in the broad sense, the Indian cultural zone, or the subcontinental regions. It's also a way to put it. And that's not accidental that it's in those regions. And it doesn't mean that it was only in the far corners or reaches of India that these developments were going on, that Buddhist scriptures were studied in different languages. It's simply that these are the regions where ancient manuscripts can survive. It's a climatic factor, in other words. In India proper, monsoon climate, extreme heat and humidity, so manuscripts rarely last more than a few centuries. In the drier and colder climates, in the fringe and in the fringe of India and Central Asia, manuscripts are less subject to environmental or climatic danger, and they in some cases survive for hundreds and even for thousands of years. So that's the rationale that I refer to these things as these places which are not India in the strict sense, but I refer to them as the Indian Buddhist world, which is to say, in linguistic terms, the regions where Buddhist scriptures were preserved and studied in an Indian or any Indian language. So finally I come to what I think is my main point, which is the Gandhari language. Gandhari language is the language of the region which was called in ancient times Gandhara. Gandhara is approximately northern Pakistan and the adjoining areas of eastern Afghanistan and a little bit of northwestern India. I mean India in the modern sense, nation of India. And for historical and political reasons, that region in the first 2 or let's say 2.5 centuries of the Common Era, of the AD era, that was a great cultural and political capital of India, with a series of influential dynasties, mostly invaders or immigrants from outside of India, from Central Asia, came into India and it would appear very enthusiastically took on Buddhism and became great patrons. I refer specifically to the Kushana dynasty because that's the best known and best documented dynasty from about the middle of the 1st century into the 4th century. So that was the great glory days of Buddhist culture in the Northwest, in Gandhara in ancient times. And not coincidentally, that's the time from which we have now huge amounts of information and increasing knowledge of the development of Buddhism in that time. We have inscriptions, many hundreds of Buddhist inscriptions, which, among other things, document the generous patronage of Buddhist institutions by these Kushana and other dynasties of non-Indian origin. So we have that, and we have what I briefly mentioned before. We have now a large number of manuscripts from approximately the same period in the Gandhari language. So I'll just say, what is the relationship of Gandhari to the other languages that I've been discussing, mainly Sanskrit and Pali? Well, to put it simply, they're all sisters, or more strictly speaking, daughters and mothers and daughters. You can say that Sanskrit is linguistically the mother language. It's the older language. And Pali and Gandhari, you could say, are 2 daughters of Sanskrit, 2 sisters. And so they're fairly similar. If you know Sanskrit and Pali, you can learn Gandhari fairly easily. But they are distinct languages, and they're also distinct in the way they're written. First of all, let me mention they were almost all, the large majority of the Gandharan manuscripts are written on birch bark, scrolls made of birch bark. they would long strips of bark, and they'd write the manuscript, the text on it, and then they would roll it up from the bottom like this. And because birch bark is very soft and pliable when it's new. When it's 2,000 years old, it's extremely brittle and fragile. So the result is that these manuscripts that we have, which are, as I may have already said, by far the oldest surviving Buddhist manuscripts anywhere, 2,000 years old approximately, they're extremely difficult to deal with, and they're very fragmentary. And so working with them is quite a challenge, and sometimes frustrating, but of course revealing and exciting. And they cover most of the major genres of previous Buddhist literature as previously known, and also there are texts of types that we've never seen before, and they're sometimes quite baffling and sometimes quite interesting. So we have a lot of sutra texts, and most of them are texts that are parallel. You can see the corresponding version in the Pali Canon and or in the Sanskrit manuscript from Central Asia. So again, you get a kind of triangular relationship. We have other sutras that, interestingly, do not have a parallel. I'm speaking now of what we call the Agama Sutras, the basic early literature that's represented in Pali. But we also have Mahayana Sutras, and this is very interesting, important for the long debated question of the historical origins of Mahayana Buddhism. We know of, if I remember correctly, 12 fragments of 12 different Mahayana scriptures. Some of them are quite familiar. Very familiar is an example, is the form of the Prajnaparamita, or perfection of wisdom sutra, or type sutra. So that's a very important discovery that we have that now in Gandhari. We have also several other, among the dozen Mahayana sutras, are texts that were previously unknown in any language, in Sanskrit, Chinese, Tibetan. So I often find myself using the image or cliche of the point of the tip of the iceberg. So what we know, even with these great new discoveries, what we know of the totality of what once existed in Buddhist literature, there's clearly a lot that we don't know about, but now we're finding out, at least, as I said, the tip of the iceberg. The implication, which I believe very strongly, and I think is generally agreed to by historians, the implication is that besides these local Buddhisms, like the Sanskrit Buddhism of Central Asia and the Gandhari Buddhism of the far northwest, Pakistan, Afghanistan region, there must have been also regional Buddhisms all over India proper. Why don't we know about them? Well, as I mentioned before, because their scriptures could not survive. They could only survive by being copied and recopied periodically to prevent them from decay. But as everybody knows, Buddhism died out in India proper. But it's pretty easy to extrapolate, and as I said, I believe it's generally accepted that what we see in Gandhara is something that must have happened in several other, maybe many other parts of India, and they would have had their own regional literatures, and those literatures would probably have been, or at least have started out, in other regional dialects. India, as maybe people know, is now and always has been a land of many languages and dialects. So that's what I mean when I use the plural phrase, the lost Buddhisms of India. We've found some of them on the fringes of India, and we can guess that there were many more. And I have to conclude on a down note, which is that, as I said, those other Buddhisms are not likely to ever be found. In fact, I very much doubt that they have been found, but we've learned a great deal from what has been found within the relatively recent past.